Hello and welcome to a conversation on Blandtown, an Atlanta neighborhood located west of Midtown. I'm Gregor Turk, a visual artist. My studio has been located in Blandtown since 2003. And in recent years, I've been focusing on Blandtown as a subject of my artwork, including photography and sculpture. I'm joined today by Dr. Rhana Gittens. Hello, Rhana. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Rhana has a doctorate in communications from Georgia State University. In her dissertation, she not only upends the long-held story of the neighborhood's founding, but also uses Blandtown as a case study of gentrification and racialization of space in regards to the Atlanta BeltLine. The title of her 2020 dissertation is Displacing the Black Mecca, Romanticizing or Witnessing African American Historical Trajectories in the Case of the Atlanta BeltLine. First off, congratulations on completing your doctorate. Your dissertation is really remarkable. It's dense, thought-provoking, challenging, and persuasive. Thank you for a well-crafted and informative paper.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So let's start off with a little background.
Sure.
Tell me about yourself, where you grew up, and your interests.
Well, I'm originally from Florida, South Florida. Grew up in Lauderdale Lakes. And went to the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. So definitely a girl that loves the sun, misses the beach a little bit, living here in Atlanta, and I enjoy the outdoors as well. But I guess one of my biggest interests that has brought me here is just a little bit curious about history. Curious about people and cultures and things like that, and kind of brought me to the place of Blandtown and brought me to what I study now in my dissertation, which is gentrification as well as space and place. And so one of the key issues that I focus on is Black life and kind of the loss of home and the experience of losing home. So specifically, I focus on having spaces of thinking of home as a space where you feel protected, when you feel safe, where you feel you can express yourself culturally. So I use my work to focus on the ways physical and aesthetic Black spaces are lost, as well as the cultural work that marginalized groups do to create a sense of place in anti-Black or anti-person of color locations.
So did you have ties to Stone Mountain, or there was a reunion I think you talked about at one point in the introduction of your dissertation?
Oh, yes, definitely. So when I was probably 16 years old, my family had a family reunion here in Atlanta. And so we all drove up from Florida. I also had family from New York that flew in to Atlanta. We met at Stone Mountain, where we had majority of our family reunion events there. And so that was an interesting experience. I don't think I'd ever been to Atlanta before that. And of course, people know Stone Mountain is a Confederate memorial in itself within a mountain. And at the time, I didn't know any of that history. But now that I do know that history, we of course have pictures and images from our family reunion. And we have a picture of like my dad, my brother, and some of my cousins all standing with the Confederate generals behind them. And so now I look at that picture, and now that I know the history, it's so interesting to think about the fact that those generals never expected my Black father, my Black brother, my Black cousins to be in that space, at least not alive in that space, so to speak. It's not funny, but in that case, they didn't expect that. I think of it as these meeting up of ghosts is kind of how I talk about it in some ways, where, the ghosts of the past are seeing the presence of my family in this space, and we're changing history as it happens. So,
when did you realize that photograph, the sort of the irony of that image? Was it while you were at Stone Mountain, or when the photograph was taken, or was it years later?
It was years, definitely not when it was taken, because I didn't know much. I didn't know who the people were on the mountain at the time when I was 16 years old. I just didn't know. So it was probably when I came here again, probably at age 21, 22, after I had graduated undergrad. And then I knew more of the history, and I started realizing, oh, okay, this is a Confederate memorial, because my first time there, I didn't even know that. And that's when I started making the connections of, this is a big deal for me to even be here, because and you think of it's just a short span of time, a little more than a century ago, that I probably wouldn't be there, at least not in the same form or fashion.
Well, I think that's what's interesting about what comes in later into your dissertation is this ability of you to observe and to not just accept what is sort of there. You definitely dig deeper. And I was just curious if that's, if that was something that was always with you as a child, or if that sort of developed when you got more involved with rhetorical studies.
Definitely.
Okay.
Rhetorical studies definitely kind of opened me up to being able to look at the world differently, and be more curious about what I was seeing.
Yeah, yeah. Let's see. You got your PhD from from Georgia State.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about how your research started to come into focus. I mean, we met in 2017, I believe. I guess what might make more sense is let's go back to the when you went to the goat farm. Mm-hmm. What brought you there? Talk a little bit about that, and sort of leading up to the longstanding history of Blandtown.
Definitely. So at the time, I was literally just trying to take some updated photos of myself for Instagram and social media and things like that. So I was with my photographer, Latoya Bourne. She actually said, there's this place, Goat Farm Art Center. She'd been hearing about it. That was a great place to take photos. And I looked it up. So I just Googled it. And I think at the time I was in a critical theory class. And just thinking of critical theory, we were already talking a little bit about art and, just learning the significance of space and place. And so it just made me want to know, if I'm going to take a picture here, I should probably know what this place is that I'm taking a picture at. And so I looked up the Goat Farm Art Center, and it said it was located in Blandtown. This was a Wikipedia search, so this wasn't even a deep research study at this point. So I looked on Wikipedia, then I saw it said it's located in Blandtown, and so I clicked the link to Blandtown and followed the breadcrumbs and saw, Blandtown, in Wikipedia was a very short paragraph about it being one of the first African American neighborhoods after the Civil War, and that the land had been given to Felix Bland by his previous slave owner. And so I saw that, and I just thought it was interesting that there wasn't much information there. I was just like, why isn't there for it to be, one of, to me, it should be a historical neighborhood in that case, and that there would be more info. And so it just caused me I started Googling more to see, like, Blandtown, just trying to see if anyone else had written about it, to find more info. And that's when I saw your post with your website with your the billboard that you have in front. And so I drove around and I found the billboard, took a picture of it as well. And then I went home. I was still questioning it. I was like, there's gotta be more here. Why isn't there more written on it? So I happened to have had an Ancestry.com set up already, because I was researching my family. So I said, hey, let me look up the Blands. And I looked it up, and I looked up Bonnie Bland, and quite immediately it showed that she was a Black woman on the census. And just from there, I was like, oh my goodness, I found something. And suddenly I became a scavenger in hunt of a mystery, and just spent some time, about a week or two, going to the archives and things like that to try to really, confirm the information and make sure it was correct. And
that's how you spent your spring break.
Exactly. That's how she went to spring break. And that was all she wrote. It was kind of serendipity that I just got led to it out of pure curiosity.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really interesting because that's the story, and I just took it at face value. I mean, and I went back trying to find where it was written. I mean, it was allegedly said, or the history was given by Sarah Huff, who was a longtime resident here and historian. So it's really interesting. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But the rest of the story, why don't you finish the rest of the long-held story, although it's not correct.
Okay, so the original story was that, of course, Viney Bland had given this land to her previous slave, Felix Bland, and, well, given her home to him, and also paid for him to go to school. And that was literally all that had been written. And now, after I did the research and finding out quickly that Viney Bland was not a white woman, then started doing some research into the deeds. So I found out that it wasn't actually Viney Bland who had the land first. It was her husband. It was Samuel Bland. He'd purchased the land in 1872 from a Francis A. Kimball, who actually owned other pieces of land in this area. And so he purchased it for $200. He was a plasterer, is all I could really find on the census. He's originally born in Virginia. And he also had a freedman's bank account. So assuming that at some point he was a slave and then he was freed, because that's what those bank accounts were set up for, were for people who'd been freed. So anyway, finding out that in 1873 he deeded the land to his wife, Viney Bland, which I believe Viney is a nickname for Lavinia. So in some of the texts you'll see Viney, some of the texts you see it written as her full name, Lavinia. And that he may have died around it's unclear exactly when he died, but around 1880s, 1890s. But regardless, she kept the land for a while, and then she passed it on to her children. And from there, Felix Bland and his siblings kept ownership until around the 1920s, 1922 is when the deeds start. Their names are no longer showing up on the deeds, but it's unclear exactly who it may have gone to, other than possibly the church, is what some of the deeds show, is that he deeded the land to the church around 1920s.
But he sold the land.
Correct, exactly.
Okay.
That he sold the land to the church around then. And at that point, he was much older as well. And so it shows that they basically had the land in their family for about 50 years. And of course, during this time, other Black people were moving to the neighborhood. And so we have the Blands here. They own a segment of the land, but then a lot other portions, people purchasing different units, different acres, and a lot of them coming to this particular location because of the railroad and because there were jobs here. And it was because it was the place they were allowed to live. It wasn't necessarily the nicest location, it wasn't the most hospitable location, but it was the spot where they were allowed to be, and they created a community here, and they're basically a working community, and developed schools and churches in the area.
Right. So the long-held story is that Viney, thought to be the slave owner's wife, gave this land to Felix along with a Tuskegee institution education, and then Felix lost it for not paying taxes. So, and that's pretty much the whole history. So it's this narrative of the benevolent slave owner and the naive, or I don't know what you would say, indigent, that couldn't afford, or couldn't afford to pay it. So your research, which was mainly through censuses and also through land plats and dockets, I guess, at the courthouse, which was pretty involved. You upended all that, and it's a totally different narrative now. So those tropes, those stereotypes of the benevolent slave owner and the naive indigent, do you think those are intentional, or do you think it's just a reflection of what the time was, and it just gets built in? I mean, it's so systemic. So
it's a little bit of both. So I think that form of history is easily believed, And it's a story that's not questioned because people don't like to feel guilt. So it's an idea, to assuage your guilt of slavery and things like that. You want to be able to say some people were benevolent, people were gentle, there were slave owners that were kind. And that's the nice romantic story that makes you feel good inside. So it's easy to believe. It's not something you really want to question, generally speaking. And of course, there's people who intended to misrepresent those things on purpose, and those stories become prevalent and pervasive. And so even those people who aren't intending to do it start to share those stories and continue that misrepresentation. And mostly just they tend to not question it because, oh, well, I've heard a story like that before, so why would I question this one? But I can really say that when it's not only a thing that a white person would not question, it's also something that a Black person wouldn't question as well, because when we think about ideologies of racism and systemic racism, it's built into all of us, right? Just so we're all living within it. That ideology, that edict, it's hard to disrupt because we all live it every single day. And we all want to believe the good. But in the end, we actually lose the good. To me, we lose the good when we forsake the truth and we cause these things to continue to be repeated when we don't ask those questions and just be a little curious. Hey, I might have asked those questions and found out nothing. I wasn't really planning on trying to upend anything at the time. But we should ask those questions once we realize that there could be more there. Because it's only the thing, what I always say about history and why I think history is so important is it's like any story that we learn, even fables. They're there to help us learn some type of morality, to learn a lesson. And so if we don't know the real story, then we miss out on the lesson that we were supposed to learn from it. And so we end up repeating that same thing over again.
But the real story is so much better. It's the cliche of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. But think about it. This is during Reconstruction, that narrow window when African Americans could actually do things. They could purchase things. They could, and so right. For what was it, $200? Samuel Bland and Viney Bland bought 4 acres of land.
Right.
And there's receipts for showing that purchase, and going from there. Then they gave it to their children, and then ended up with Felix. But that's really a remarkable story, because after that narrow window, it became a pretty tough thing for African Americans to purchase land, to
right.
Of course, vote even. There was that little narrow window again, with having some representation. So I think that's a great story that is starting to get a little bit of momentum. I know there's some organizations here that are helping to retell that story.
Right.
So that's really good. So kudos to you for having the gumption to do research and to not accept something
right.
at face value.
And it's true that you bring that up. It made me think just for a moment, when you tell the benevolent slave master's story, it closes, it ends the story. And so you don't ask any more questions. Oh, that's it, close the book. And that's why when I went to Wikipedia that first time, that's the only sentence there, because it was like, oh, that was it.
Yeah.
No more story to it. But then when you do get the real story, it's actually more intriguing.
Right.
And it makes you
right.
want to ask more questions.
Right. Well, you talk about closure, and maybe now's a good time to talk about it a little bit. In your dissertation and in our conversations in the past few years, that of witnessing and how one finishes with witnessing if you close it or if you leave it open, and it affects the races differently. So right. You want to go into that a little bit now, or what are your thoughts?
Do you want like a specific example?
Sure.
So in my dissertation, I focus on this idea of witnessing a story versus romanticizing a story. And so to witness a story, you have to, if you are going to, you have to find a way to witness it in full. And this idea of having a narrative closure is kind of a way to say, we already learned our lesson. We nothing else to see here kind of situation. And if we have not learned our lesson, then it becomes a false closure of a story. And so a good example of that is kind of our story of the civil rights movement, in which it often gets romanticized as, especially when we talk about it primarily from the idea of MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., and it gets romanticized as, well, we got voting rights, we ended segregation in schools, and so that's the closure of the civil rights movement, as if those two things solved all of the world's problems. And then we also close it as if when MLK Jr. died, the whole movement was over, right? And so what happens there when we close it that way is we stop thinking about the fact that segregation still exists today, that we see it right now in our election, that there's people who are dealing with issues of losing many of their official rights for voting, from poll closures and gerrymandering and things of the such. And so when we close a story and we say, oh, it's been resolved, we had our Voting Rights Act, we, passed Brown versus Board of Education, all good here, then we stop trying to make things better. We stop looking at those problems, and that's the issue of closing a story too soon.
Okay, we'll probably come back to that, because I know that narrative of witnessing is really important.
Right.
So let's finish up the history of Blandtown. It's
Okay.
The name is derided, of course. People don't think much of the name, so that's part of the reason it's kind of went out of, even to say favor is not really doing justice. I created a logo for Blandtown for my exhibition, and it was just an image of from the goat farm, coincidentally, of the water tower as the center. And then I just had 6 dates around it. It said founded 1872, red line 1931, burned 1938, rezoned 1956, raised 2008, and gentrified 2016. And what's kind of amusing about that is that I actually put that on T-shirts, and people are wearing the T-shirt. I mean, I love the fact that it's kind of weird that some of the people that actually gentrify this neighborhood are wearing T-shirts that say Gentrified 2016. So that's the cliff notes of the neighborhood. But do you want to kind of go in through the history of the rezoning a little bit, kind of bring us up after Bland sold the property?
So around 1956, and this is some research that I actually received from Larry Keating at Georgia Tech. He was doing some work on some of the ways that urban neighborhoods get displaced. And so he was studying Blandtown at the time, and he found that in 1956, the area got rezoned from a single-family home neighborhood into an industrial neighborhood. And so what happens there is basically you cannot, I believe if it's more than 50% of your home is in disrepair, that you won't get any assistance from the city in order to repair your home.
Well, I think you weren't even allowed to.
You weren't even allowed to repair.
Yeah, and the
definitely
houses,
couldn't build a new home.
And the houses like this one cost $2,000 to construct.
Right. So that was what they were living with in that case. And so inevitably, so if that happens, so 1956, imagine you're living in a neighborhood, it gets zoned as industrial, and you get wear and tear on your home, you can't do anything to fix it, and you can't rebuild. So, and over time, this isn't a desirable place to live. I have the dates here.
I think it was late 50s, I think.
Yeah, after the late 50s into the 70s, you start to see a huge decrease in the number of people that are actually living here and displacement of the residents. And another thing that we have to take note of that I recently just made a connection to was at the same time we have integration of neighborhoods. And so now Black people are actually able to move. So I think of at the time before 1956, or actually before the 60s, there was nowhere else for them to go to anyway. But now, okay, we've been rezoned, but now we do have other options of where we can move. And so we find that by the 70s, some of the people who were living here actually moved to some areas in Southwest Atlanta, West Atlanta, where now they were starting to integrate and they were allowed to be in those neighborhoods. So you see a huge shift where you have a loss of residents here and some of them just kind of leaving their homes or renting them out, but not necessarily watching out for them in the case, kind of absent from the neighborhood in many ways. And so you see dilapidation of homes, you see vagrants coming in, and that's kind of the neighborhood that you start to see around the 80s and 90s. And then industrial growth. So you have still a small segment, and you'll probably be able to add to this as well because that's when you came into the neighborhood, but you see a small segment of remnants of homes at this point, and a few people still living here. Even people like Azalea Wharton, who actually tried to continue to fight to get the zoning change back from industrial into single family home again, but lost that fight to the chemical company, who in many ways it becomes this question of industry versus homeowner. And it's a issue, honestly, that you're dealing with today that has not ended in this area. But unfortunately for poor African Americans who are living here, they didn't have as much power or voice to win that fight, unfortunately. So what you see again between the 80s and 90s is heavy increasing in industrialization of this area and businesses coming into the area, and most people just drive by it. Like they're not thinking of this place as anywhere someone wants to live, right? It's one of those things you drive across in order to get downtown if you're coming from a suburb out on the west, but you're not stopping here by any means. But I think Gregor, he made a stop.
I did. I think, you talk about the chemical company. I think we should go ahead and name them.
Okay.
It's Nottingham, which I find quite appropriate because, it was the sheriff of Nottingham that was always taking the taxes and oppressing the people that Robin Hood rose up against, and stole from the rich to give to the poor. And so here's the name. Nice. Nottingham here in the middle of town. And then again, so they led the movement back in the 50s to usurp the existing neighborhood association that was run by the actual African American residents, and created this new neighborhood association that was basically all industrialists. And so they were able to convince the city that, yes, we're all for rezoning, and so totally undid the existing residents. And there was, numbers vary, but somewhere between 200 to 300 homes in this neighborhood. And as you mentioned earlier, it was not a desirable place to live. I mean, it was sort of, in between three sets of railroad tracks, and you had at the top of the hill you had slaughterhouses, and then down here you had a fertilizer plant at the bottom of the hill, and also a rendering plant. So they're bringing carcasses through the neighborhood. It's a smelly place. It's a loud place with the trains. All that is going on, and so no wonder people wanted to move away from here when other options exist. But it wasn't through free will. I mean, I think that's what's really got to be remembered, is that it was a very deliberate, very racist practice of the cities. Now, I think you also, or maybe it was Larry Keating in his book, Atlanta Race, Class, and
Urban Expansion,
that he said it was also for voting reasons. I think the city had just expanded. Is that, do you recall the details on that?
Yes, this is one that I researched. So what ends up happening is Mayor Hartsfield during this time was mayor of Atlanta. And at the time, this northern, you would kind of call this the northern side of Atlanta. Blandtown was in many ways one of the furthest north Black neighborhoods because majorly, and it's basically the same way today, South Atlanta was more of the Black population, and then the North was white population. And what was happening is white families were fleeing the south of Atlanta to go north into areas like Buckhead. And Buckhead and Blandtown were not a part of Atlanta. They were not official Atlanta city neighborhoods at that time. But in order to be reelected, Hartsfield was like, well, I'm going to need my white voters back to stay mayor of this city. And so he fought for the annexation of the northern neighborhoods. And so Blandtown came in because of that, and Buckhead came in because of that. And then right after that occurs, that's actually when the zoning changed to industrial. Mind you, if you look at maps, they knew this was a Black neighborhood. So it wasn't by any means that they were like, we didn't know people were living here. Like, they knew people were here because they have a map. I believe it's 1953 that showed it as Blandtown, this little small Black neighborhood in the midst of North Atlanta. But in 1956, they chose to switch it over to industrial right after it got annexed.
So, and it was a very vibrant community. It had, I think, 3 or 4 churches. Is that
Yep,
correct?
exactly.
It had a school. It had, people that had, I guess, I don't know. Today we'd call it a pop-up, but I mean, people in their houses, they would also have a place to purchase items and things like that. So it was a very active and, as I said, vibrant community, and it was a place where people that lived here could walk to work. They worked on the rail lines, or they worked up at the slaughterhouse. A number of options that were suitable, for African Americans, or were deemed suitable, I should
right.
say.
And many joined the armed forces, as we know. So.
Right. So you and I have both interviewed a number of former residents, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
Sort of the stories, maybe a couple of stories, and you were, how many did you end up interviewing for your dissertation? Like 4 or 5? Of the former residents.
Of former residents, I had officially 3.
3. Okay. Okay. So so we've had conversations. We've actually done walking tour with father and son, and there were some really rich stories. I mean, it was not a pretty picture always. I mean, there was, as I mentioned, there were it was not an ideal neighborhood, but it was an African American community. It was owned.
Right.
I mean, there was a lot of home ownership here, which was unlike other communities, I think. But what was your takeaway? I guess we can start off generally from some of the interviews of the former residents.
Yeah, definitely. There were a lot of interesting moments with the former residents, and the one that stands out to me often, and I tell other people about it, was actually Warren Green. He says, and I'm gonna paraphrase him, but he says, whenever I go out there now, it's not the same. It doesn't look anything like it used to look. But he says, if I can put snapshots, like he says, if I can put pictures of what it used to look like on top of what I'm seeing now. And I just love that, because it was an interesting way of thinking about memory, and how connected our memories are to the places that we've been. And even ourselves, if we go to old neighborhoods that we grew up in, it's like you walk in and you start to say, I know what was there, I know what was there. And it doesn't look the same, but you can visualize it so well because you walked up and down those streets so many times. Like, you just know, you would know it with your eyes closed.
Right.
And
well,
that's
I was just going to put some context. Like, directly behind you is the bedroom that Warren grew up in with his 4 siblings. So it was 5 children that were raised in this, what's now my studio in this house. It was built by Johnny Lee Green. And we were both fortunate to know him, even though it was what proved to be his last couple of years. He passed away in 2018, but was a really interesting fellow. But I also thought it was really interesting how the two, the father and the son, had very different opinions of coming back here. You've reflected on Warren, the son, but what do you think of Johnny Lee Green's reaction? It sort of surprised me a little bit.
Yeah, so Johnny Lee, he moved. He's the father, and so he moved, I guess, in the '70s, and so and had a home in south portion of Atlanta, and he really liked his new home, right? And so he had a different experience, whereas with Warren, he has this intense nostalgia for this place as the place he grew up, the place where his siblings were. It's just a different type of nostalgia you get from his son.
Yeah, Warren will come by on occasion and we'll talk, and you can just see him kind of looking around, and he loves the fact that this house is still standing. And then he'll go back and look at the vegetable garden. And he goes, "Yeah, this is what it was like having the vegetable garden with it too." But I think, and I hope I'm not reading into this, but I think that because Mr. Green, the elder, was of the Jim Crow era, that he was more accepting of this was forced upon him, and that's just the way it is, and I'll move on. And he was able to sell the house and buy a place in Cascade. But I think for Warren, it was like, well, that's not right. It doesn't have to be this way. What do you think? Do you think that's a fair assumption, or do you think?
Quite possible. I mean, I've seen it even in even my own family and other people I've talked to, where you ask them a little bit about maybe the 30s, the 20s, and those who are still alive, because they don't seem to talk about it, right? And so even in my own family, I'm like, it's not like they're walking around talking about Jim Crow and segregation and saying, I used to not be able to drink from the water fountain. Like, these aren't conversations that we're necessarily having with each other that people might assume that Black people are having with their grandparents. But it's not something that just happens from talking to other people. It doesn't seem to be extremely common. So from my own experience, it's not until you ask, what was it like? And they'll often, my experience has been, they'll say, it was just what it was. It was this idea that this is just how life was, and it was their norm. And so there isn't that intense way when me being a younger generation, I'm looking at it like, wasn't that horrible? Weren't you mad? And they're like, we survived. It's just the way life was.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. So I think you've talked to folks pretty extensively in your interviews, but you also conversely talked with new residents. What was your takeaway from the new residents of Blandtown?
So with the new residents, many of them are aware of the history, and so the previous history, the one that was incorrect, as well as the new one that I've shared with them and Gregor has shared with them, so they know how both have changed. And many of them want or have a fervor to know more and to respect the history and reclaim that history. Like they acknowledge that it's something that's important. At the same time, they also recognize that some of the same troubles that the African Americans had in this neighborhood in regards to the fights over business in the space of a residential area, because obviously the people listening, they might not realize that in this area there's lots of businesses still around.
Industry is
still around, and so there's still those fights over industry and residential that are here, but they also recognize that the income level here has risen I'm saying astronomically in the sense that it's risen over the last 10 years, way different from what it was before. And so they have an economic power that, of course, the African Americans who were living here before did not have. And they have a voice that the African Americans that were living here did not have. So a little bit more capability of negotiating and at least getting any industrial changes to hopefully work in their favor to some extent. The give and take of the negotiation that is happening there. And also the acknowledgement that Blandtown is like in some ways like a a centering point. If you want to think of Blandtown, it's not the center of Atlanta, but if you want to imagine it for a moment as the center, right south of this location is primarily African American low income area in Bankhead, right? And then directly north of this area is Buckhead. And so you're sitting in a place that kind of centers the segregation of Atlanta. And so it's just this intense recognition that there is segregation here, and you notice it just from living in this space. You realize, wait, we're segregated, aren't we? And you might not have noticed it before.
Yeah, I mean, I think the new neighborhood is somewhat integrated. I mean, you do have a mix of people, but it's completely based on income, right? Going back just for a second, I do think it was interesting that the former residents did not know even the history of Felix. There was no that narrative of the slave owner giving the land. That was not there. And so then you go forward and you look at the new residents, and you have a conversation. And when I had my exhibition last fall, there was an artist talk, and there was somebody from the media there, but there was also a couple of people from the neighborhood, the new neighborhood.
Right.
And I was asked the question, well, what do the new residents think of of the history, or knowing what was here before? And I said, ask them. And so one person I remember stood up and said, well, it does make me feel a little bit uncomfortable. So I think I don't know if I would call it full-on white guilt, but it's some level of uncomfortableness, because I mean, it's been removed. You had this developer, Steve Brock with Brock Built, who basically bought up what was left over here. And there were, when I came here in 2003, there were 21 original houses still standing. Now there's 4. One was converted into a church years ago. So this studio stands as one of the very last houses that were here, and very much of the style. I mean, this studio was built with concrete block and brick, and that's one reason it was able to survive, because a lot of the other houses were wood and just went into dilapidation. But let's talk about that a little bit. Where I guess responsibility, but where things lie with white and black of basically removing this neighborhood, and where people are, or where people should be, and witnessing, where witnessing comes in with the folks that live here now.
So it's difficult, right? So really one of the big questions I had was, when a neighborhood has been completely displaced, because you have neighborhoods now that are going through gentrification, but they haven't been completely displaced yet. You still have the former residents there. Whereas Blandtown doesn't have that experience because everyone's been displaced. And this history is coming 30, 40 years after they've all moved away. Right. And some of them, like unfortunately, one person that we were interviewing, the person who built the home we're in right now, passed away, and so those are the situation we're dealing with now, that they're not even around to. Some of them might not be around to share that voice, and so we say, well, what do we do with that? Well, there's a few things. The first is, the only thing left here is the name. And that's the only thing that really kind of attracts you to it. It's the only stamp of recognition there. I think of it kind of like when someone passes away and they have a stone over them, their body, and it says their name. And that's all that's left, really, of them, is that name. And there's so much power in that. There's so much power in the memory of the name. It's the idea that I existed. I was here. And so
you see Blandtown as an epitaph.
Right, exactly. Perfect. Like a perfect metaphor there for an epitaph. And without the name, it quite literally would cease to exist. Those memories in many ways would be lost for generations to come. And so what I think is important now is to keep the last living relic, which is that name, because it's currently being washed over by West Midtown, the name in name. That most people know this area as West Midtown. They if I said I'm going to Blandtown today, they would, what's that? They had no idea what I'm talking about. But if we can find a way to really put that name there, then you're continuously speaking that existence over and over and over again. And someone somewhere will that curiosity can always come back up. I think one of the people I interviewed, he brought up high schools and how we named them after famous people or presidents and things like that. And the next generation, like you name a high school, George Washington Carver, Booker T. Washington, the next generation might have no idea who that is, like especially if it's elementary school. But then they'll ask, like, who's this high school named after? And that's what you want. You want to keep the name so that someday some little kid will say, why is it called Blandtown? And then that memory gets to live again.
So that's I guess a form of witnessing. But in terms of closure, like not that there's a happy ending,
right.
But like, where does that fall with the new residents and even with the developer, with Brockbuild? And he's not the only developer
right.
of this neighborhood, but he went so far as to totally rename his development Westtown, which, is as generic as they come. And, yes, there's West Midtown, Midtown West, the West Side. Those are the names that are used frequently. And I will say that there's a reason for that, is that Blandtown is a fairly small area, and then Home Park, and
right.
So it sort of amalgamates all these different areas. But at the same time, and I'd be interested in sort of some of the ideas that you presented in your dissertation, this that renaming, the significance of that.
So West Midtown, or that word West, it's actually used a lot, and it's predominantly like a form of romanticizing and actually westernizing a name. So you'll see that in every state, every area has a West something.
Well, even West End was renamed.
Right, exactly, West End, exactly. And so what happens there is what it brings, or the connotation it brings, when you name something West something, is a upper middle class neighborhood, in a white neighborhood. That's the connotation we have to areas with that West in them. And that's something that has occurred over centuries of time, coming back from Europe, right? And so even if you just research that naming convention, that it's a Western naming convention. Now, granted, we have neighborhoods that now are like West End, but it was originally planned segregated white neighborhood, right? That then, after white flight, now is a black neighborhood. But again, noting that the name West was being utilized to be a kind of signal that this is a Western neighborhood, and thinking of Western as European in that case.
Yeah, I also think that the West Side is sort of a sanitized version, saying that, what the West used to be for Atlanta, was the same. West and South Atlanta always meant black.
Right.
And so by, I don't know, reclaiming it or reusing the name, it's sanitized. It's actually safe. It might as well be called
right.
Safe Town.
Safe Town, exactly. That's a good one.
So I want to read a quote from your dissertation. African American historical trajectories can be disrupted when spatial narratives are used to erase black existence, rescue whites, and continuously reconstruct white dominant power structures. And then you go on to say the Black Mecca can be maintained when the spatial narratives are dialogically coherent, make moral disorder observable, and make black history and memory visible in the built environment. So let's talk about the phrase rescue whites. I mean, that's a pretty strong phrase, and I guess another way to say it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is some form of alleviating white guilt.
Right.
But why did you come up with that term? Or is that a term that you created, or is that a more common term?
It's actually not a term I created. It's actually a sociologist theory, Glenn Bracey. I'm glad his name came to my memory. Glenn Bracey actually originally used it. And what he was referencing at the time was actually academics. That when we write theories, when we're trying to trouble a issue in racism, we often start with, I am not talking about all white people. This is not, we know all white people are not bad. It's like always preferencing it with that, so that when a white person reads it, they don't feel bad. And so what he was trying to say is you don't need to keep apologizing over and over and over again. That we don't have to continue to rescue white people every time we try to talk about what we're experiencing. That you can just talk about it. And then he talks about different ways that we do that through language, either through personification. So instead of, what that is instead of saying this person did this, instead we talk about the thing. A big luxury hotel was built here. We don't say who built the hotel. We talk as if the luxury hotel just sat itself down right. Instead of saying how it got here. So that personification of making the inanimate object a thing that moves and talks and does things, when it was the actual person who did that. And that's one way that we rescue whites. And so that is kind of what I'm referencing there, is that we when we tell these stories, when you brought up the trope of we're changing the story to show the benevolent white savior kind of ideal. It's another way of rescuing whites. And it's not to say that those moments didn't happen, but if we're always changing the truth in order to do that, then we're sacrificing the truth in order to rescue whites from what actually occurred.
So getting more specific with Blandtown on that, so here you have, right immediately around me are 45 homes with this development, and then another 75 homes are under construction, and they're probably a third through with that, which is down where the rendering plan is. So the people that are moving in, maybe they don't know about it when they move in, maybe they find out about it. Where do you think witnessing and processing what's transpired here? I mean, it's like, in a way, it's like slavery. It's like, well, that wasn't my generation. I'm not responsible for that.
Right.
But certainly, the systematic racism that's been built into our society and culture and economics and everything carries that up.
Right.
And I think that's really come to a head with Black Lives Movement of like where do you take responsibility? But let's go back to my question.
Okay.
Of like where should people be on this?
In regards to like when we're rebuilding these cities?
Well, no. I mean the residents here. I mean.
Okay. So in this situation, they should really be on the point of trying to figure out how are we going to tell the narrative of Blandtown, because when you guys are in a space, or residents are in a space here where developers are still coming in, negotiating with the neighborhood association on what they can do here. So neighborhood association has been given voice, as well as the NPU meetings that happen, and just so they have to make sure they know the history, right? Because when a new business comes to town and says, hey, we want to set up here in Blandtown, you need to be able to articulate, well, we have a history here. How are you going to, what are you about to set up here? And then asking questions, what are your prices going to be like? Is this going to be something where where all people of all race, gender, sexualities, feel like they can come here, religions, what have you, and feel like they can come here? Or is this going to be a place that ostracizes people from coming into the space? Even in the architectural setup, and I'm not an architect by any means, you can close a place out. Like even if you have a sign up, everybody welcome here, you can put it in a place where no one can see it, right? Or in a space where it's so closed that no one can really get down the street to get to it. So you're finding ways to close them out just by the way you kind of position a location. And so just really thinking more intricately about the things you're putting into an environment and investigating the welcoming of the quote unquote other into your space in order to build that diverse environment.
There is some of that happening with the neighborhood association. It's galvanized a bit after a cement facility was trying to move in close to Brock's development. But one thing that's been happening with the new developers that are coming, it's more of a request than a mandate. I think it should be a mandate, is that, quote, we would appreciate it if you would use the name Blandtown in your marketing. Okay, so it really needs to be, you're required to do this.
You're required to, yeah.
I know you talked in your dissertation some about public art and museums having a place in that narrative of witnessing. You know, and clearly my billboard stands as a form of a public art.
Witnessing, right?
Some might call it a middle finger, but I think it was very deliberate, and it was timed with when this community was first moving in, and how abhorrent I found that it was being branded strictly as Westtown. So as far as people coming in, you see just more witnessing, but that's not coming from the original residents. And so I find myself in an odd position where, you know, I'm equally as guilty in that I came in early, clearly, and I came in because this was zoned light industrial, and I could have my studio here. And so I overlapped with some of the last residents here, and then, of course, now with the new residents. So, you know, I don't know how witnessing can take effect. I mean, obviously, I can't. What are some other ways, or what would be some effective forms of public art that put that witnessing to the forefront?
Right. So first, I guess I should define how does witnessing work to make change. So basically what it does is when you have that art, when you have the museums, those public spaces that are homage to history, it's this idea, again, I'm coming from communication and rhetoric, which is all about persuasion. And so if we're telling the stories and learning the lessons, that the generation after us is, again, learning from that lesson. So you're continuously we tell fables, we tell myths, we tell our you know, the Jack and Jill stories, all these things in order to teach our children a lesson. Well, now we can give them these lessons of history. It can keep them from repeating it, right? So it's already happened in Blandtown, right? And so Blandtown stands as an example for what could happen to West End. If we tell this story of Blandtown and we make it known, it can influence other people. Granted, there's going to be people who just don't care, right? There's going to be people who, you know, don't have respect for the history. There's always going to be that. And I'm not trying to convince those people. You're trying to persuade that person that audience that is likely to persuade it if they just knew. Right? And but if they never know, then hey. So what you're doing is you're putting it in their face. So at least they can't say they didn't know. And then when that person becomes the developer, or that person just becomes, hey, I bought a house in the neighborhood, they may also become that person that says, well, I'm gonna show respect to the Black person that moved next door. I'm going to make them feel part of this community. I'm going to give them a voice in the neighborhood community meetings. When we're doing a negotiation for businesses to come into our community, because now I know the history of this, and we have options over maybe two different types of businesses. Hey, I might choose the option for bringing in a person, depending on, that might be from a different economic standpoint than myself, or somebody from a different ethnicity of myself, because now I know the history, and now I feel something about that. And again, we're not going to influence everybody, but if we never tell the story, there's a whole bunch of people that I'll never know. I would have never known, right? If no one had told me. And so that's the whole purpose, is using the stories and narratives as a form of persuasion to get us to change. And I think it's something I often exemplify it in Nazi Germany, right? So they teach about what happened, so that it doesn't continue to occur, right? Mm-hmm. They don't allow people to use those symbols, those hateful symbols anymore. It's illegal, because they don't want the history to repeat itself.
Right.
And so when we have to tell the truth about history, and we have to actually say those hateful symbols are negative, and then we can start to get to a point where we stop letting it repeat itself, so that what happened to Blandtown doesn't then also occur in West End, right? And that's what that's what I'm trying to use witnessing as a form of influence.
Right. So let's go back a little bit on the personal side with you. You did this photo shoot, you started doing some research on Blandtown. I know, I remember encouraging you when you told me you were going to be working on your dissertation. It's like, oh, come on, you got to do it on Blandtown. You said no. And so then that developed along with Dr. Sims-Alvarado's project on the BeltLine, the art on the BeltLine of the civil rights photographs as part of your dissertation, and then also a narrative about West End. So those three things came together to construct your dissertation. How did that happen? Like those three, not disparate because they are all connected by the BeltLine,
right?
And certainly are talking about racialized space. But kind of walk us through how that gelled in your mind.
It wasn't a very artistic gelling. It was pretty, I needed to get to some things to study and to find things that I could do for a dissertation, because obviously you have a limited amount of time. And so one was with Sims-Alvarado. She had the civil rights open, I would say an open museum where there was photographs of different events in the civil rights movement that were being shown along the BeltLine. And so I go to the BeltLine periodically throughout the year. And so it was up, and I recognized that it was something rhetorical that I could study and analyze. A lot of times when I look at these things, I don't know what I'm gonna find. So I was like, I just want to look at the full museum that she's created and see what story is there.
And to be clear, the exhibition was on both the East Side Trail and the West Side Trail, which are very different in that one is more developed than the other, and also racially a very different makeup. But yeah, I was just really intrigued in how you broke it down. You went back to the book and you looked at how each chapter was erected and what was left out and what was repeated. I mean, that's some pretty complex stuff.
And these things just come together for me. I have to say it's God that's doing it, because it's not like I planned my end in the beginning. I just said literally, hey, there's these photos out here, let me go see what's happening. I didn't know originally that there was a book attached to the photos, and then I found that she had a photo book album of the civil rights movement. Now, of course, there's a difference here. So in a book, you can have as many pictures as you want, generally speaking, whereas on a spatial exhibit outside, you're limited by how much space you have and a little bit more cost and money to get all those photos up around the BeltLine Trail. And so there's not going to be as many photos, so that's understood. And so I just did an analysis of what was chosen from the book. And specifically because when I went around the BeltLine, I looked at the photos and it felt slightly, honestly, I didn't feel anything much. It was like, okay, photo. If I wasn't, most people were walking by them. There was nothing there that disrupted the space. When you see art that like disrupts you for a moment, right? You've done some things even with the eyes. It's something that like, what is that? It disrupts the space. The photography that was up at that time, I noticed that many people weren't stopping. It wasn't disrupting their walk. It was just like, we're gonna walk on by. But then the book, I opened the book and I started going through the book and I was like, oh, I'm feeling stuff here. And so I knew just from my emotional change that there was something different. And so that's when I started dissecting what's in this book that's making me feel this way that's not on the BeltLine, and what is the difference? And finding that there were those stories of lynching of the KKK, that, and those, I shouldn't say stories, those photographs of that, of police brutality during protests. Those photographs were in the book and not on the BeltLine. The photos on the BeltLine were more, PC. They didn't make me sad, emotional, or anything about them. And so immediately just recognize that what we're putting to be public is romanticizing the history of the civil rights movement. A book, I mean, you don't have to open a book, but on the BeltLine itself, if you're walking it, you got to see these photos. So on just a PR basis, there was a decision made to put photos that weren't going to disrupt a person's walk on this, but it would, in some ways, pacify anyone who wanted to see history shown or Black history shown. And then a Black person walking by might say, oh, it's so nice to see ourselves here, and not even realize, that's not even they're not even showing you the real story, right? And so that was what I think was most interesting about that one.
Let's take a little sidebar here and talk about trauma,
right?
Because you kind of brought that up. So where do you stand on continual trauma or exposure? I mean, talk about that a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, the trauma is hard, right? And so, of course, traumatic experiences aren't things. I'm not a therapist by any way, so to speak. But of course, we understand that traumatic experiences are hard on anyone. And so, when people are creating public art, it is this question of, even when we think of television shows, what can we put here? What disclaimers, if we do put something traumatic, what disclaimers do we have to use? So there's all those things that we have to balance in a public space that you might not have to balance in a book, right? But at the same time, we still have to ask ourselves, what do we lose? Is it even worth putting this up if we're not going to show the truth, right? So I would always say when we're making public art decisions and we're balancing between the traumatic and the truth, you always have to ask the question, what do we lose by not putting this?
By sanitizing it.
By sanitizing it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think it's true. So anyways, you discussed the public art installation of those civil rights images. And even in your dissertation, you go back and you link which ones were taken where in the city, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then, but you do kind of wrap that chapter up about saying that things kind of end a little bit differently on are more resolved on the east side as opposed to the west side. Talk about that a little bit.
That was super interesting to me. So on the east side of the BeltLine is where you have a higher income on the east side than on the west side. So the west side goes what has already been developed of those two sides of the BeltLine. And so what was happening with this story on the east side is you saw images of MLK Jr. getting awards from the city or from Coca-Cola CEO and things like that. You see him getting the Nobel Peace Prize. This idea of it's all done, we did good. It's been resolved. We love MLK, which if you actually know the history, when he was actually alive, he was very much unloved. But the east side of the BeltLine, where you're going to get a larger population of just more affluent white residents. Honestly, it's very diverse. But when you're walking on the BeltLine, extremely diverse walk. But that's the story that's being told over there. Then on the west side of the BeltLine, where you have a less affluent area, lower income area, the story over there shows his death. It shows a few of the protests. Nothing super traumatizing there, but it's just showing those aspects. And so the argument I make here is that on the east side of the BeltLine, where you have the chance to influence a white audience, they're getting the story that we've already done enough. It's all good. On the west side of the BeltLine, where you have a black audience, is saying, hey, if you want more to be done, you got to do it. It's your job. It's still showing images of direct action and all this stuff, and like, pull yourself up by your bootstrap. You got to fix it. So it's not bringing anyone else into the game, any allies into the game. It's still leaving all of the onus and all the responsibility on the people over on the west side of the trail if they want to make any change happen.
Yeah. Did you have a conversation with Dr. Sims-Alvarado on that?
I have not.
Okay.
Oh my goodness. I've been trying to get in contact with
really?
her. Yes, and so I'm actually planning on emailing her again, because then after I couldn't get her before the dissertation was done, and then this happened, COVID-19. And so I'm getting ready to revise everything for the book version, and so I'm like, I can't publish a book without interviewing her first. Right. So definitely going to interview her before that.
I was just curious on that. On that. So that's the second component, is the public art. Mm-hmm. And then the third component is West End, and I really learned a lot on that one. I mean, you know, I knew most of the stuff going into Blandtown because we've had these conversations and we've interviewed the same people, but the West End one really sort of surprised me.
It's my favorite.
You go back to the Whitehall Tavern, and then, you know, you talk about Walt Disney, which is Lee and White, the development there that's gone up on the west side trail, and that there are 7, what was the term you used? Not brewing, but 7 fermenting beverage retail venues there, which is really pretty remarkable.
Because there's one kombucha one.
Yeah,
and
right.
So I can't say they're all beer.
That one, yeah. But basically, they're either beers. The majority are beer and spirits.
Right.
And so what I did not realize was there's this history of prohibition prior to prohibition for African Americans in that area. So kind of give us I know there's a lot to unpack there, but if you can give us the shorter version of sort of your take on the West End and how that plays into your dissertation.
So the West End one, I have to say that was my favorite one. It's like the last chapter of the book. It was the last one I did, and it was not one that was originally planned. I had a different plan, and that plan didn't work out. And so the beer, Malt Disney, came in, and it ended up being exactly what was needed. And so the question I was trying to answer really was, I wanted to do something on West End, and I went on a tour with a historian there, and it was this they were having conversations like different things that let you know that an area is being gentrified, and you have your yoga places that'll pop up, cafes that'll pop up, craft beer that'll pop up, and it's like, how do you know something's being gentrified? The craft beer. And so at least for West End, that is primarily the type of business that has gone into that area. And so they have seven beer locations or fermentation locations that have been opened up in the warehouses that are right along the BeltLine walk. So what is interesting about that, I started doing some mapping stuff to get a visual of this, like trying to figure out why is this important. So I started looking up the locations that are important to Black history in that area, and noticing that none of them are actually on the BeltLine, and so you can't even see them. So if you're just a person that's walking on the BeltLine, you wouldn't see any of the Black history. You would just see Lee and White and Walt Disney. And Walt Disney is the AKA, of that area. And so when you think of the storytelling of the neighborhood, again, you're witnessing that you literally have a prime area where people are walking around the BeltLine where you can feed them history and stuff like that, and you've lost all of that, right? And you've covered up all of that. And the history there's so many interconnections with this beer stuff. It was actually not originally a black neighborhood, so we have to make that clear that it started when it actually became an official neighborhood. It was supposed to be a white enclave. It was specifically set up to be that way after Reconstruction, because the Union Army was actually set up right north of the neighborhood, and that's where black people felt safe. So there were black people set up right north of the neighborhood, and so they're like, wait, we need seclusion. So they make their block, and they cut it off with streets and things like that, and create their enclave. And they actually had a few breweries in the area. So the place started with Whitehall Tavern, where people used to drink beer. And a German came there, and one of the first Atlanta brew places was actually right there at the time called Whitehall. And so it's just interesting that beer was there, right? So that was a history before black people were living in the neighborhood where beer was there. But then many people, of course, know the history of Prohibition in the United States. So Prohibition, of course, happened right here in Georgia. And one of the big things that led to Prohibition in Atlanta was the idea of the drunk black man raping all the white women. And it led to a race riot in 1906. That eventually led to Prohibition in Atlanta, which ended the beer, a lot of the beer business that was here in Atlanta. And to see that, okay, you get rid of beer in West End because, well, our biggest fear is black person with beer, so we'll stop drinking beer just so they can't get it. And then you see black people, we eventually have white flight once there's integration and black people are able to move into that neighborhood. Eventually white people move out of West End and it becomes a black neighborhood that is known across the nation within black culture as a little piece of black culture because of the many things that happened there with they have largely different religions located in the area, as well as art, a museum. It was a location where people used to go to the club, go to the mall. So it's just very, very well known with black people.
But also Spelman, Morehouse.
All the colleges are right north of there. Man. And so it's a very well known area in black community. And now it's not gentrified yet, at least not completely. We could say it's gentrifying, and the members of West End are, grappling with that and the threat of that and the lack of BeltLine coming in. And then the decision in regards to how to use that huge warehouse space was to bring beer back, changing the laws in many ways to make beer profitable for those groups. And we asked the question, how come black people don't really drink beer like that, right? So you want to know, why though? It's beer. People like beer. Why don't black people drink beer? And that's how you go back to the history, because it was illegal for a long time for black people to be able to drink it publicly. That's where you got the brown paper, people walking around with the brown paper bag, because it's illegal.
What I'd like you to do is if you would just, I think it was the last page, is to summarize your dissertation with your final remark, if you would.
I submit that the past, including its failures and successes, traumas and healings, cannot just be witnessed once, but requires a continual enactment of remembrance. Perpetual remembering is an act of constant learning, requiring each generation to recognize the ghost of the past and at the same time seek the spiritual calling of the future. By doing so, we don't simply claim the history as nice to know, but we consider the history as a starting point for change and a requirement to not recycle the sins of the past, but shed those detrimental practices to turn toward a future where everyone belongs. James Baldwin wrote in his book, The Fire Next Time, that if the word integration means anything, this is what it means. That we with love shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change. And so I think my final thesis for this whole dissertation was the complete understanding that African American historical trajectories or histories can be disrupted when spatial narratives are used to erase Black existence, rescue whites, and continuously reconstruct white dominant power structures. The Black Mecca can be maintained when the spatial narratives are dialogically coherent, make moral disorder observable, and make Black history and memory visible in the built environment.
Well said. Well, I think it's been really interesting watching this process go on for the last 3 years, and then to be able to read your dissertation. I mean, you got to be incredibly proud of it. I mean, it really is a well crafted, as I said, document, and I think it will have a lot of future meaning. Just like Larry Keating's use of Blandtown as a case study, I think your use of it as a case study, keeps that going, and I do hope that the story of Blandtown gets told.
In 2019, you did the exhibition, and so I think we have a small piece of that here. It's a much bigger exhibition. But what made you kind of decide that you wanted to use your space, that exhibition space, for Blandtown?
Well, I mean, it was a very physical thing being built around. Well, first off, the neighbors were displaced that were here. The street was actually a mix when I moved in. You had somebody making cabinets, you had people that actually owned their houses, and then you had vagrants living in abandoned houses. But I think also knowing what the development was, seeing what was being removed and being witness to it all, over 17 years,
right.
Was really pretty remarkable. And how that, I grew up in Atlanta. I mean, my grandfather worked at the top of the hill at the one of the slaughterhouses, and so not that I had any connection to Blandtown, but this is where my studio was, and I bought it specifically because I could afford the property here, and just watching those changes was really pretty remarkable, and so that influenced me. Now, of course, my work deals with placemaking, with mapping, and with cultural signage. So, I sort of finally saw that I've been doing an artist in residency here, and an involuntary one, but a very, pleasurable one. I mean, not to say that it was forced upon me, but this is a very different vision that I anticipated for this neighborhood. I mean, I really thought that some of the former residents would still be here, and the empty lots would get filled up with houses that were in scale with some of the other houses. But that was not the plans for the developer that bought everybody up, but me, basically. So that influenced me, and I felt it was time to tell that story.
Very good. Where do you see how you have changed through learning this story? Do you feel like parts of your identity have changed or anything as you've learned more or been a part of this process?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, one of the biggest issues I've had is that, I'm the white guy telling the story of the African Americans that were here beforehand, but I don't know who else is telling the story. I mean, there's been such a diaspora of the former residents, and also the age of which a lot of them are. And so I find myself in this awkward position of telling that story, but I think it's a really fundamental story, and it's a repeated story. Now, granted, the story of Blandtown is a little bit different because it was so absolutely deliberate with rezoning, and so I think it's done a little bit more subtly with gentrification. But I think the BeltLine really brings that to a head with how Ryan Gravel's original vision was and what is actually happening. So yeah, I think it's certainly influenced my work in terms of land use and or how we perceive land use, and even marketing. You know, I've really for some of the work in the exhibition, I really kind of played around with that, with branding concepts. And I mean, this is obviously like agitprop. I mean, it's meant to look very propaganda-like. It's got the Helvetica print and our fonts. It's a very deliberate, you could say heavy-handed. But it's also, this series is called Red, White, and Black. And so it's also asking questions. Each piece has the prefix re in it. And so some of them are reconstruction, which is obviously very deliberate and heavy word. But some of them are wordplay, and some truly are just pondering.
To build people's curiosity, I guess.
And the future for this series is, for the exhibition, they were only done as, I think, 20 by 20 inches photographs, but I did print 4 this size to sort of start to see what would happen scale-wise. And so they were put in the window of Gallery 72, where the exhibition was. But now I'm working on a grant, and hopefully it'll come through, and I'm working with folks in the community to actually have these up and adjacent to the marketing of some of the developers, and have this up and have people have a conversation, or my goal would be to incite a conversation about some of these issues.
And what were some of the other works that you had there?
Well, I divided the space into 2, and the name of the exhibition was Reclaim, Proclaim, Blandtown. So I was kind of taking a 2-pronged approach to the work. It sort of worked out very well because the gallery space was also divided into 2 sections. And so for the Reclaim side, I had 3 main pieces: Rugae, Trace, and Retrace. I've been working with repurposed bicycle inner tubes with rubber, and so Rugae was essentially a topographic map of Blandtown, and I just thought it was a really suitable material since it's an industrial. We even have a tire recycling facility here, but I just thought it was an appropriate material to render the lay of the land. So there was that piece, and then there was Trace, and Trace was the footprints of 21 houses that were here when I moved in 2003, or set up my studio in 2003. And so they create a shadow and are about vacantness. They're about negative space. And then Retrace was a much more colorful piece. It was constructed with somewhere between 45 and 50 boxes, rubber wrapped boxes that were then painted. And the palette came from the colors that are used for the new construction. And in the very center of all these boxes was a square, a negative hole, and that was my studio, you know, now being surrounded by these. So again, you know, I kind of took a conceptual approach on some of the work on that side of the gallery, but then on the other side was more deliberate. For example, I did a piece called Blandtown. And so I went around and photographed all these different commercial buildings that had used West Side or Midtown West or whatever, and then I just photoshopped them so that they said Blandtown, to actually proclaim the name Blandtown. What would that be like if these businesses actually did that? So a bit tongue-in-cheek, but you know, it was pretty subtle, so a lot of people could miss it, and that was okay. I also did a poster that was called The Tires of Blandtown, and it was just a series of dozens of photographs I've taken just walking around the neighborhood of tires that have been discarded, that have been trashed here. And it was a spin off of The Doors of Dublin, which is a pretty well-known poster of really beautiful doors all found throughout Dublin. I also did a piece, well, we talked about Red, White, and Black, which was the series here to my left. And then I also made some t-shirts and stickers. I just felt like, you know, if you're going to proclaim, that's the way to get it out. And so I did a couple of different versions of Blandtown t-shirts, including a logo. And just having the bumper stickers were kind of fun as a giveaway for people to walk away with. So yeah, and also in that exhibition, and we haven't talked about this, is that I included the history for the reclaim side, and then I also coincidentally the facility that Gallery 72 was formerly the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and so I included several dozen articles that primarily were AJC about Blandtown, and then I also printed them out in a readable format where you could sit down and read all these articles if you wanted to. But this one, it struck me, and it obviously struck you because you quoted it in your dissertation.
Yes, this one was written in 1914 in the Atlanta Constitution. And the headline was just Blandtown, not on Howell Mill Road. It says, citizens living on the Howell Mill Road want it understood that Blandtown, where the murder of L.D. Grant took place last week, is not located on Howell Mill Road, but is approximately a mile away near the Seaboard Yards. We have never had any such outrageous crime in our community, said one Howell Mill Road citizen, and our people are not the sort who do such a thing.
Yeah, it says it all, doesn't it?
Right. Complete separation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Rhana, it's been a real pleasure. I, again, really appreciate what you've done for Blandtown, giving us a completely new and correct narrative of its origin, and the dissertation that I think has really good meaning, or great meaning for not just Blandtown and the city, but I think has applications well beyond just Atlanta.
Yeah, definitely. I'd have to agree with that. It's been a journey with Blandtown and with the city of Atlanta, and with all the things going on in our current society. It's definitely something I think that the story won't end here, for sure. And I see more people getting curious, so that always makes me happy.
Good. Well, again, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.